Britain has descended into an energy crisis. Rocketing energy costs will mean the average domestic fuel bill will have risen by over £400 in a year. Fuel at the pumps has never been so expensive. And some food prices have seen a hike of over 40%. Many people are being pushed into poverty.
Possibly the biggest crisis that this country faces in the next few years is that within 6 or 7 years we're going to lose 40% of all the generating capacity, all the power stations that actually are keeping our lights on, our computers running, the whole of our civilization working. When that happens, we will be in one of the biggest crises this country has ever faced.
With North Sea production in sharp decline, the UK is heavily reliant on imported coal, oil and gas. And all but one of our nuclear power stations will shut down in the next 7 years. It leaves a substantial gap, and Britain at the mercy of global energy markets. But at this most vulnerable time, the UK government has lost control of British energy policy to the European Union, with catastrophic consequences. EU environmental directives will force the premature closure of our vital coal-fired power stations and have imposed unachievable and costly emissions targets that have distorted the UK energy strategy and left it with few viable options. Britain is out of control, and it is costing the earth.
We are paying the price for three things in this country in terms of energy. One is the fact that we had all that North Sea oil and gas, which meant for 20 years we didn't have to think about where we were going to get our energy from in the future. The second has been the sort of environmental wave which led us to lose touch with the value of nuclear power stations. They became a dirty word and no one wanted to build any new ones. The third thing is that we are completely hamstrung by what Brussels is deciding about renewables, about biofuels, about lots of other things to do with our energy, the closing down of our coal-fired power station. So we are no longer in any way masters in our own house. So we are uniquely making a mess of it.
What the energy issue is doing is bringing the British people for the very first time hard up against the facts of life of being in the European Union.
The chaos started here. The EU issued a range of environmental directives imposing onerous targets for reduction of carbon emissions. It demands that by 2020, 20% of our energy needs come from renewable sources. But this precludes using proven alternatives to fossil fuels such as nuclear power. So the UK is being driven relentlessly down the road of unviable and more costly solutions, such as biofuels and wind turbines. The UK government's headlong leap into their current energy strategies is skewed towards meeting those crippling obligations rather than securing long-term sources of energy for Britain.
90% of our energy supplies are going to disappear over the next 20 years. For Britain, it doesn't matter what we do about CO2 so far as climate change is concerned. We emit about 2.5% of the world's CO2 per year. If we disappeared off the face of the earth, that 2.5% would be replaced by China every 3 years. So the issue for Britain is overwhelmingly how do we secure our energy supplies in the best possible way, and by best we mean secure and cost-effective ways.
Yeah, well, you've got this massive contradiction in the EU's policy. It says we've got to cut down on CO2 emissions, therefore we've got to have lots of renewable energy. But of course, the best, by far the most efficient way to get the maximum amount of energy is by building nuclear power stations. But that's not included in the renewables targets.
The irony is, the cost of building 10 nuclear power stations in the UK, which would provide up to 25% of our energy requirements, would be less than 2 years' contributions to the EU. signing up to the unachievable EU targets comes with a monumental cost, and the UK government is funding it by a range of stealth and so-called green taxes, now making up almost 10% of UK government revenue. A government-commissioned report has warned that because the UK has currently such a low base of renewable energy, it will cost each UK household more than £3,000, almost double the cost expected in France and Germany.
The strategy for us is to replace our national source of energy as present in the North Sea with a national source of energy under our own control, and the only possible candidate for this is nuclear power.
But EU directives are forcing the UK government down the wrong road in pursuit of renewables. So thousands of wind turbines will need to be built across the UK in locations such as here, in the Yorkshire Dales. Local campaign groups are being formed across England to combat the proliferation of such wind farms.
When I go around the constituency and see people and talk to people in village halls who are trying desperately to protect their villages from these grotesque developments, one of the main questions that they ask me is why. They don't work, they're not going to decommission a single power station, conventional power station. It's just a tragedy, a desecration of our island, and that's the question people are asking. To what end? This is, in point of fact, one of the great lunacies of the age. You'll see over here, behind me, this is Drax Power Station, which produces 4,000 megawatts of electricity. Even if I had a magic wand and I could produce here and now 12,000 wind turbines to meet the megawattage of Drax, it wouldn't make any difference. We'd still need Drax in the background because you need the backup, because the wind doesn't blow. So it isn't even green.
In Germany, they have found that their 19,000 wind turbines have not resulted in the closure of any of their conventional power stations, as they have been retained as backup for when there is insufficient wind to turn the turbines, around 70% of the time. Power stations on immediate standby are also a very expensive way to generate electricity, the equivalent of cycling to work whilst a car journeys behind carrying your bags.
If we were foolish enough to build windmills, this would cost somewhere between 2 and 3 times the cost of building it via a nuclear station.
For the UK to commit to so many wind turbines in such a short time will require widespread extensions to the national grid. And whereas in a normal world the expense and inefficiency of these wind farms would price them out of the market, lavish subsidies make wind farms very lucrative. It is known as the renewables obligation, and a single turbine can potentially earn the operator £500,000 a year, of which 60% is subsidy.
The way it works with wind turbines is, or indeed any renewable source of electricity, is that the people who sell you and me electricity have to buy a percentage of their power from renewable sources, and they pay twice the normal price for it. So there is a massive hidden subsidy which we're all paying when we get our electricity bill.
All around the world, farmers are turning over their fields to growing crops to produce biofuels, crops grown specifically to be processed as fuel for motor vehicles or burnt in power stations. It's purported to be the green solution to our energy problems. The EU has grandiose plans to be self-sufficient, setting unrealistic targets of 10% for homegrown biofuels production, a target that would require 70% of all arable land to be taken out of food production. In a futile gesture to meet that target, UK agriculture is turning arable land over to growing biofuels, harvested to be burnt in coal-fired power stations, not for efficiency, but to meet quotas.
This was a cornfield until 3 years ago, and we're turning over thousands and thousands of acres to this stuff when we should, in a world which is desperately short of food, be growing crops. Crops have become more expensive, twice as expensive as they were only a year ago. And people in the world are actually starving, and while we grow this stuff to burn when we should be growing food. It's the economics of the madhouse.
The whole argument for biofuels falls down on every possible level. It isn't particularly CO2 emitting saving. It costs a great deal of money by comparison with even the inflated cost of oil today. And thirdly, of course, it abstracts from the world food production and our own food production very, very valuable sources of food.
The biofuels policy is completely mad. Brussels eventually is going to have to give way and realise that we can't give over half the farmland of Europe to growing fuel for our cars.
The land needed to produce enough grain to fill the tank of a 4x4 with biofuel just once would feed one person for a year. The targets are unachievable, and when 27 EU states turned to importing biofuels to meet targets, it had disastrous consequences for global agriculture. Millions of acres of land have been converted from food production to growing biofuels. The USA and the EU have considerable influence, so much so that according to a leaked World Bank report, their demand for biofuels has pushed world food prices up an incredible 75%.
If we continue to try to meet the renewables obligation, as narrowly defined by the European Union, it is going to cost us at least £1,000 million of imported biofuels. That is the direct cost. The indirect cost is yet again a diversion from the real need, which is to tackle the impending and critical energy crisis facing our country.
It is estimated that by 2020, the costs to taxpayers could reach £50 billion. The EU environment policies are not only pushing us inexorably into an energy crisis, they're also threatening our agriculture. Something is happening in the arable fields of England. Mounds have started to appear in the corners of crop fields across the country. Closer inspection reveals that they are heaps of industrial waste, sewage waste, human waste, waiting to be ploughed into the fields.
Well, this is another triumph of European Union lunacy. We have the 1999 landfill directive, which means instead of putting our filth and muck into a great big hole in the ground and covering it up and landscaping it, which is what we used to do, we now spread it across the land and call it compost. It stinks like nothing on earth. This is actually not compost, this is industrial waste.
This is where the waste originates. Local farmers are paid by the ton to take it away and stockpile it in their fields until they can spread it on the land. It's a way of circumventing swingeing EU landfill taxes imposed upon local authorities if it were to be dumped in landfill sites.
So this classifies as recycled, and if the local councils don't meet the tonnage of recycling, they get fined directly by the European Union. So whatever filth is in this, it isn't in the interests of the local council or the Environment Agency to find anything wrong with it or really prosecute seriously any illegal spreading of it, but the simple reason because if they can't get rid of this stuff, they get fined.
The situation has alarmed brewers and food product manufacturers, so much so that some are refusing to accept crops from fields that have been contaminated in this way.
Nobody understands the consequence of it, and I would suggest that this is an accident waiting to happen.
Britain appears powerless to limit outside interference and damage to its economy. It has little control over its imported energy. It is forced to commit to biofuels targets that are unachievable. It has embarked on a futile wind power strategy that requires huge subsidies. It is fettered by landfill directives that distort the market and put our agriculture at risk. And it is all being paid for by the British consumers in the name of environmental idealism. Britain is out of control.
So much decision-making, policy-making, law-making is now contracted upstairs to Brussels. And the result is that whether you're looking at waste policy or energy policy or postal services or any one of a vast range of things which get constantly into the headline, we are not running the show anymore, and we no longer have civil servants whose job it is to work out how these things should be done properly in the interests of the British people.
One of the big lies I think we have is that the European Union is wonderful for the environment. It might have all sorts of other economic problems, but it's actually wonderful for the planet and the environment. The point I'm making that it isn't. We've just looked at landfill directives, and we've looked at the terrible problems they're causing. We've looked at wind farms and the terrible problems they're causing, biofuels and all the absurdity that that brings to world food prices. And I haven't even talked about the common agricultural policy and the common fishing policy. So it's a disaster. The European Union is a disaster for the environment, both locally and globally. And as soon as people wake up to this idea, the better off we'll all be. We shouldn't be run by Brussels. We should be looking after our own environment, looking to the common sense aspect of environment back here in our own country.